In 1976, a doctor in Maine gets a phone call from a man who says he wants to talk about a UFO case the doctor had been helping with, and the doctor agrees. He hangs up the phone, and before he can even turn on the outside light, the man is already walking up his porch steps. There's no car in the driveway, and he never heard one pull up, but at first the visitor looks normal enough that the doctor lets him inside. And then he takes off his hat, and he has no hair, no eyebrows or eyelashes, and his skin is almost completely white. And while they're talking, the doctor realizes that the man's bright red lips appear to be painted on. And then the visitor tells him his energy is running out. Dr. Herbert Hopkins lived in Maine and worked as a physician and hypnotist. In the mid-1970s, he had gotten involved with a strange UFO case involving a young man who claimed he had been experiencing something unusual near Thompson Lake. Hopkins wasn't the person who had the encounter. He was helping with hypnosis sessions afterwards, and then on September 11th, 1976, Hopkins was home alone, and the phone rang. The man on the other end introduced himself as someone connected to a UFO research organization in New Jersey. He knew Hopkins had been working with the witnesses from the main case and said he wanted to come over and discuss it. Hopkins agreed. He gave the man directions to his house, and then they hung up. Hopkins walked towards the back of the house to turn on an outside light so the visitor would be able to find the place, and he hadn't even made it there yet. There was already someone coming up the steps. Hopkins would later say that there was no possible way the man could have gotten from wherever he made that phone call to his house that quickly. There was also no car, but the stranger was standing at his door. Hopkins let him inside, and the man was dressed extremely neatly. Black suit, black tie, white shirt, and black shoes. Everything looked freshly pressed, and he also wore gray gloves and a black hat. Then the man removed the hat, and that was the first time Hopkins got a good look at him. His head was completely bald, and this wasn't just a man who had lost his hair. Hopkins said he had no eyebrows, no eyelashes, and no facial hair at all. His skin was incredibly pale, almost white, and his nose looked unusually small. His ears seemed lower than they should have been, and then there were his lips. They were bright red, so red that Hopkins thought that the man was wearing lipstick. Still, they sit down. The visitor starts asking questions about the UFO case Hopkins had been working on. And as Hopkins answers him, the stranger keeps repeating essentially the same response. Yes, that's the way I understand it. Again and again. He seemed to already know most of the information he is asking Hopkins to give him, and then the conversation gets much stranger. The visitor suddenly tells Hopkins that there are 2 coins in his pocket. Hopkins checks, and there are. The man tells him to take one out, so Hopkins places a coin in his palm, and the stranger tells him to watch it. Hopkins stares down at the coin, and according to his account, the edges begin getting blurry. And then the coin seems to change, and eventually it disappears completely. The man tells Hopkins that nobody on this plane will ever see that coin again. And then he starts talking about another famous UFO case, Betty and Barney Hill. The stranger asks Hopkins if he knows what happened to Barney Hill. Hopkins says he knows that Barney died, and the man supposedly tells him that Barney died because he knew too much. At this point, Hopkins is sitting in his own living room with a stranger who appeared at his door almost immediately after calling him, and somehow knew what was in his pocket, and had just made a coin disappear in front of him. Then Hopkins notices the man touch his mouth. His gray glove brushes across his lips, and some of the red smears onto the glove. Hopkins realizes he was right. It looks like lipstick. And underneath the bright red coloring, the man's lips appear extremely pale and barely defined at all. The conversation continues, but now the stranger starts slowing down. His speech becomes less clear, and his movements change. It looks like he's having trouble functioning. And then he stands up very slowly and says, "My energy is running low, must go now, goodbye." He walks towards the door with this strange, unstable movement, and Hopkins watches him leave. Outside there's a blue-white light, but Hopkins still doesn't see a car. and the man disappears from view. When Hopkins' family comes home, he tells them what happened. They looked around the driveway and reportedly find strange marks where a normal car would have been positioned. By the next day, those marks are gone, and Hopkins does exactly what the visitor wanted. He destroys the recordings and material connected to the UFO investigation, and then he stops working on the case entirely. The man got what he came for, and Hopkins never found out who was sitting in his living room that night. 10 years earlier, a salesman in West Virginia met someone who looked completely human, at least from a distance. His name was Woodrow Derenberger, and on November 2nd, 1966, Woodrow was driving home from near Parkersburg, West Virginia. It was cold and it was raining, and he was driving a truck loaded with sewing machines and other equipment. At around 7:25 that night, something came up behind him on the highway. Woodrow initially thinks it's another vehicle, and then it passes him, moves in front of his truck, and then blocks the road. Now he can see that it isn't a car. He later compared its shape to an old-fashioned kerosene lamp chimney. It was dark gray, and it had no normal windows, no visible wheels, and it was hovering above the road. Woodrow stops, and then a door opens. A man steps out. And this is what makes the encounter so unsettling. He doesn't look like a monster. Woodrow describes a normal-looking man around 6 feet tall. Normal dark brown hair combed backward and deeply tanned skin. He looks maybe 35 or 40 years old. He's wearing dark clothing made from some kind of shiny material, and he's smiling. The man walks toward Woodrow's truck, and Woodrow stays inside. And then he hears the stranger speak, except the mouth of the man isn't moving. Woodrow can hear him clearly, but the voice is inside his head. The stranger tells Woodrow to roll down his window, so he does. The man stands beside the vehicle with his arms crossed and continues communicating without moving his lips. He asks Woodrow his name, and he asks where he lives. He seems interested in the lights from Parkersburg in the distance. Woodrow answers him out loud, and the stranger answers inside his mind. And then he introduces himself. He calls himself Cold. Later, Woodrow would use the name Indrid Cold. Cold tells Woodrow not to be afraid. He says he means no harm. He explains that he is a searcher, and throughout all of this, he keeps smiling. There's something almost polite about the entire conversation, and that makes it stranger. Woodrow isn't being chased, and nobody grabs him. He's sitting on the side of a wet highway having what looks like from a distance like a conversation with an ordinary man. Except only one of them is actually speaking. And behind the stranger is an object hovering above the road that shouldn't be there. At one point, the object rises while Cold remains beside Woodrow's truck. Woodrow can see it hovering higher above the highway. Cold tells him that they will see each other again, and then the object comes back down, and Cold steps inside. Somebody else appears to be inside the craft. A hand closes the door behind him, and then it rises and disappears. Woodrow drives home, and instead of sitting in this story for years, he tells people almost immediately. The next afternoon, November 3rd, he goes on a local television. The original interview survives. He sits there telling the story less than 24 hours after he has says that it happened. Newspapers pick it up, and then things get even stranger because Woodrow says Cold does exactly what he promised. He comes back. Woodrow begins claiming that he could hear Cold communicating with him telepathically, and the contact continues. Eventually, Woodrow says Cold tells him much more about where he comes from. And the later stories become huge. Woodrow says that there are other beings. Eventually, he claims that he's traveled with them, but even if you strip every story later away and stay with that first night, you're left with a very creepy image. A man is driving home alone, and something forces him to stop. A normal-looking stranger gets out, and he walks up to the window. He smiles. And then Woodrow realizes the stranger doesn't need to move his mouth to speak to him. And then they'll see each other again. And according to Woodrow, they did. The last story starts with two kids asking for a ride. That's it. No strange craft or glowing lights. No warning that anything paranormal is about to happen. In 1996, Brian Bethel was working as a journalist in Abilene, Texas. One night, he needed to drop off a payment for his internet service. So he drove to a shopping center and parked near a movie theater. It was late, and Brian stayed in the car and started writing out a check. And then there was a knock on his window. 2 boys were standing beside the car, and they looked young, somewhere around 9 to 14, and they were wearing hooded sweatshirts, and one had darker hair and olive-colored skin. The other was pale and freckled with reddish hair. Brian cracks the window, and the boys explain that they wanted to see a movie, Mortal Kombat, but they forgot their money at home. They tell Brian they need a ride back to their mother's house to get the money. Then he can bring them back to the theater. It sounds like 2 kids asking an adult for help. But Brian immediately feels afraid, and he can't explain why. Nothing has happened yet, and the kids aren't yelling, and they aren't threatening him. But the boy doing most of the talking seemed very calm, almost too calm. So Brian starts noticing that the story doesn't make sense. The movie has already started, and by the time they drive home, get the money in return, they're going to miss most of it. And the boy keeps talking. He tries to reassure Brian that they're just kids and they only want to get their money. And at one point, he even says that they don't have a gun, which is a strange thing for a child to say when you haven't accused him of having one. Brian's fear keeps building, and while the boy talks, Brian feels himself becoming almost strangely compliant, like he's about to do what they're asking even though every part of him wants to leave. And the boy needs him to unlock the doors. They need permission to get inside. Then Brian finally gets a clear look at their faces, and he sees their eyes, completely black. No colored iris, just black. Brian immediately snaps out of whatever was happening, and he pulls away. The boy becomes more insistent. He tells Brian they can't come inside unless Brian says it's okay, and Brian drives off. He looks back, and the boys are gone. That encounter eventually became the story now known as the Black-Eyed Children. But Brian doesn't immediately turn it into some huge internet phenomenon. The experience happened in 1996, and he wrote about it online in 1998 in an early ghost-related mailing list. Years later, as the story spread, Brian continued publicly saying that this happened to him. And the details that people remember are incredibly simple. The boys never broke into his car, and they never attacked him. They didn't chase him, they asked over and over to let them in, that they just need a ride, and we can't come in unless you can tell us it's okay. And that little detail became part of the entire Black-Eyed Children legend. Later, stories from other people began appearing. Kids showing up at houses and kids asking for rides, almost always looking normal until somebody notices their eyes. And Brian's story is still the one that started it. A journalist sitting alone in a parking lot. 2 ordinary-looking boys walk up to his window, and one of them politely asks for help. And then he sees their eyes and realizes he has no idea what he was about to let into his car. Anyway, good luck sleeping tonight.